10 years of data gives economists enough runway to perform a detailed assessment of how a modern economy separates from its primary trading partner. The 2016 referendum served as a pivot point for the British economy, signaling an intention to reorganize decades of established trade architecture. We now have the accounting. By the end of 2025, leaving the EU reduced the UK's gross domestic product by between 6 and 8%, compared to a scenario where it had remained. That decline is driven largely by reduction in capital. Business investment dropped by 12 to 13% across the country. Efficiency declined as well. Total factor productivity, the measure of how effectively an economy converts inputs into output, fell by 3 to 4%. While the period was marked by sensational headlines and political volatility, the economic reality was a gradual, compounding loss of growth. Leaving a trading bloc creates a systemic drag on growth that compounds year after year, affecting capital accumulation and efficiency across the entire system. Arriving at that final GDP estimate required economists to apply two distinct econometric tools. The first tool is a macro-level approach. This evaluates the economy from the top down, comparing the nation's total output to its international peers. When measured from the top down, the data shows an 8% drop in GDP. The second tool is a micro-level approach. This measures the impact from the bottom up, examining individual corporate ledgers, firm by firm. Aggregating firm-level microdata shows a 6% GDP drop, while the macro estimate reaches 8%. In a national economy, this 2% gap represents billions of pounds appearing in one model but disappearing in another. Identifying the source of that missing 2% explains how economic shocks spread through an interconnected trade network. The primary challenge in macroeconomics is the absence of a controlled experiment. We cannot observe what the UK economy would have done if the referendum had gone the other way. To solve this, researchers used the synthetic control method to build a mathematical counterfactual, a version of the country that remained in the trading bloc. They construct this baseline using a pool of 33 peer nations, including the US, Germany, and Japan. By calibrating these nations using 5 different weighting methods, including total GDP and geographic proximity, economists create a single baseline, a doppelganger economy. Following the 2016 referendum, the actual economic output splits from the doppelganger's trajectory, leading to the 8% gap we see today. However, the macro approach captures all external variables simultaneously, making it difficult to isolate a single cause. Over a 10-year period, variables like differing domestic fiscal policies and varied responses to the COVID-19 pandemic contaminate the data. The macro data shows the total scale of the damage, but it lacks the precision needed to confirm causality. For that, we have to look at the firms themselves. The MicroStrategy shifts the focus from national borders to individual corporate ledgers. Researchers utilized the Decision Maker Panel, a dataset tracking 7,000 firms over a decade. This allowed them to apply a difference in differences model to the data. They established an EU exposure index for every firm, based on factors like export volume, migrant labor, and regulatory oversight. This separates the firms into groups: a control group with 0 exposure, and a treatment group with high exposure. By comparing highly exposed firms to unexposed firms within the same country, the model filters out domestic noise. National events like COVID-19 impact both groups, allowing researchers to isolate the specific impact of the trade shock. The model shows that highly exposed firms contracted by a total of 6% relative to the control group. This firm-level analysis provides evidence of causality, but it brings us back to the 2% gap. To understand how the damage happened, we have to look at the timeline. Formal trade barriers and tariffs did not actually take effect until 2021, yet corporate investment began to decline immediately after the 2016 vote, years before the physical borders were restricted. This was a second moment uncertainty shock. Under real options theory, when the future rules of trade are unknown, firms respond by suspending capital projects. They avoid building new capacity when they cannot project future costs. This effect extended into productivity, which stalled as firms adjusted to the new political environment. Survey data reveals that senior executives diverted significant time every week away from innovation and toward transition planning and supply chain audits. High levels of uncertainty alone served as a barrier to growth. long before the first tariff was applied. We are still left with the unresolved gap, 6% in the micro model versus 8% in the macro. The difference in differences model is limited by a core assumption, the stable unit treatment value assumption, or SUTVA. SUTVA assumes that the control group, the unexposed firms, is entirely unaffected by the shock hitting the treatment group. In an integrated economy, that assumption is incorrect because of general equilibrium spillovers. This occurs through supply chain friction. When an exposed firm reduces its output, the intermediate goods it produces become scarce and expensive for every other firm in the network. We also see a decline in aggregate demand. When exposed firms cut spending and jobs, their workers spend less at local, unexposed businesses. The supposedly safe businesses suffer because the entire regional economy has slowed down. This creates a missing intercept that the micro model cannot see. If the control group had benefited from the shock, for example by hiring cheaper labor from failing firms, the micro estimate would be higher than the macro. The fact that it is lower proves that negative spillovers dominated. The 2% gap represents the drag on businesses that had no direct exposure to the EU, but were connected to firms that did. A decade of data also allows us to evaluate the predictions economists made in 2016. This chart maps those early forecasts. While academics and banks were largely accurate in the short term, their long-term predictions were tightly clustered around a 4% loss. This represents a significant underestimation of the eventual 6 to 8% drop we recorded. Most models accounted for the impact of tariffs, but they failed to account for the prolonged uncertainty caused by years of political negotiation. Breaking an integrated trade relationship impacts the entire economic network simultaneously, regardless of a firm's individual trade volume. The 2016 referendum provides evidence that, in a general equilibrium world, there is no such thing as an unexposed firm. When the trade architecture changes, the entire system adjusts.